All right, folks, so here we go. This is going to be our ecology unit, the intro to it, and this is going to branch out a little bit because I'm trying to make sure we've got the baseline that everyone needs, despite the fact the AP test is now over and this is not part of that curriculum. I just want to make sure that everybody has that basis that people will expect. So, a lot of this is all going to be about populations. Population. Talking about how these populations will interact with each other. How can they affect each other? What sort of models or math can we use in order to predict? So, first, let's start with that idea and figure out what a population is. So these are the these are the levels of ecology, right? We've got our simplest smalls at the individual organism. Most of what we're looking at is going to be functioning in the population and the community level. Population is going to be all of the single species, in this case, alligator. Community will be not just all the alligators, but then it will be also all the other biotics that live in the environment and the area with it. The turtles, the different birds, things like that. So a lot of the stuff that we see will be in the population and the community level. Now, when we go beyond that to the ecosystem level, ecosystem will now include the non-living things as well. Temperature, precipitation, we're going to want water studies, things like that. And then the highest level is like the biome level, where now you're just looking at this massive, huge area that all shares some characteristics. But mostly, we're going to be looking at population. All of ecology is based around the interactions and the interdependence of the organisms that live there and how they influence one another in one way or another. Now, there are simple things like the lions down here and their interactions with their prey animals because that's their source of food. Then you can also get some more complicated levels of interdependence. And interdependence is more like the clownfish you see here and the sea anemone or the E. coli bacteria that live in our gut. That's a situation where literally one, in many cases, cannot survive without the other. And we'll be looking at examples of all of these. But at the AP level, you're expected to be able to tell the difference between species richness and species diversity when we take a look at a community. So, species richness is going to be the number of different species in a community. Just the flat number. How many different animals and plants live here? 13. Great. That's your species richness. We have 13 different biotics in this one region. Species diversity, though, is a little bit more important. And this just says it's a variety of blah, blah, blah. What it really comes down to, though, is this comes down to the proportion of species in a community. For instance, we could look at two environments. They both have the same richness, kind of like these two forests, A and B. But you'll notice A has a much better diversity. It has more of each of the different trees. Whereas Forest B still has, let's say, 13 different species living there, but most of them are in very small or like trace amounts. So be prepared to tell the difference between them. Richness is just a straight number. How many different things live here? Diversity is when we start talking about the proportion of one to another. For most cases in ecology, as much as we would love to be out in the forest counting every living thing, it is just not feasible for us to do. Which means that by and large, we must use models for a lot of ecological work because we simply do not have the time, the money, and the manpower that we would need to get out and literally have individuals doing the counting and the collection and the observations. It's just not reliable. Or it's not feasible, I should say. It would be reliable, it's not feasible. So instead, we have to use these models. And we can use models to do all kinds of different things. There are some really interesting jobs in science right now where you program a model for days, weeks, months. You just program variables. Then you hit enter and wait 6 months for the computer to finish all the calculations to finally give you an answer for what it should be at the end based on the information that you have in your model. So, what you see here is trying to identify that species richness throughout a lot of Indonesia and, like, I guess, southern Asia or whatever. And with these two different models, the A setting and the B setting, you can see the A setting has much greater species richness throughout almost all the islands and regions than B does, where species richness is much, much, much lower. But we're not going to actually go out and do that to the environments. That would be ridiculous. So instead, once again, models. So don't be surprised. You're going to hear model, model, model all over the place because in ecology, we have to model most things and hope that we're getting a decent answer. An example of that is our predator prey graphs. So here we see our snowshoe hare, the prey, and the lynx, its predator. And once again, we can model this and we can get an idea of what year by year should look like. We can take a look at things like invasive species. Now, I know that looking at this, it's like, well, what? That 2010. This was made in 2000. So right here was where their data stopped on this blue line. So they had to use a model to try to figure out what's the next year going to look like. We've done this a ton for climate change, trying to figure out how bad is the planet, how much trouble is it in, based on the impacts of the human population. And make no mistake, there is no argument from the scientific community that says that we are not the cause of this. The popular press will change that quite a bit. But for scientists who actually study climate, like actual accredited scientists, actual studies that have gone through vetting and have been double blind tested, there is zero dissension. Everybody agrees we are causing huge issues to this planet. And so these models become really important because we want to know how bad is it going to look? Is it going to be on this low end here? Or is it going to be on the high end? And take a look. This is looking at the average change in temperature, and we're going up to year 2100. So 80 years into the future, trying to ascertain how big of an effect are we now going to have on them then. And of course, we can use these also for population growths. And in places like the US, we see a population growth like this. We used to spend a lot more time with this, but this year, without it being included on the AP exam, I'm not going to worry too much about you being able to read a population graph. Just look at the size of the blue versus the pink line. The size of each line indicates the number. So you can see we have very, very few people up in the 90 range, and around it, we have a relatively stable group of people from 0 to 50. And what that means is our population is holding steady. For the folks who die, there's generally about the same amount growing up to fill their spaces. So our population is relatively calm. But let's talk about the different forms of population growth because scenarios like this are a real thing, and in particular, when we're not looking at us and we're looking at other organisms. Now, the population growth equation isn't something that you guys are going to need now without the test. I'm certainly not going to ask you about this, but that's because I'm incapable of doing math correctly. So even if I did, I would be looking for an answer, which is probably going to be wrong. So I'm just going to leave this here with the variables so you guys can kind of see how it works. Now, if there's nothing to stop population, we get our exponential growth. This curve that just goes up, 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 kind of like human population. Fun to think of, huh? And almost all of human population has happened in just the last 300 years. Crazy to think that before that, we never even reached 1 billion people on the entire planet for the history going back to 8,000 BC. And now in the last 300 years, we've gone from half a billion up to now we're at almost 9 or just over. So if something really bad happens, you'll often see that kind of exponential growth. But that brings into another question about what will control growth. Because obviously, a population can become too high for the resources available, and then, well, bad things happen. So that is our carrying capacity. That is going to be basically, um, it is the maximum amount that can be sustained by the environment. And it doesn't matter what we're talking about. It could be food, it could be water, it could be mates, it could be space and territory. All of that's combined when determining the carrying capacity. There'll be good years. A good year will cause an overshoot, but then after it goes up, what's happened is this population here, the excess, has used up excess resources. So now the next year is going to be a bad year because they damaged the environment. So now the population will dip. But now, because the population is below carrying capacity, if we're talking about something like rabbits, the plant life is going to be able to start to recuperate, which means that the next year there's going to be a lot of plants. Good year. Bad year, good year, bad year, good year, bad year. You get the idea. So normal populations will wobble around the carrying capacity. They'll exceed it one year, then they'll go below it for the next. And sometimes this expands for several years as the process needs time, but we see this. This is the normal style. Now, there is a math equation to figure out the carrying capacity. I'm not going to worry about that. So, if exponential growth is one option, logistical growth is the other one. And this is our more steady. It goes exponential for a little bit, but then it evens out as we reach the carrying capacity. And it kind of holds steady. This is what we want. This is the healthy one. And all of this is going to be determined by factors that will either be density dependent ones that are going to change based on the number of organisms you have in the given area, or density independent factors, which don't care if there's a million or just one or zero. Like, for instance, when we talk about natural disasters or unusual weather like droughts, that doesn't change because there is a large herd of bison in that area. It's going to happen regardless. When we decide we're going to make a parking lot or a Walmart, we don't stop and take count of the animals that are living there. We just do it. So, once again, density dependent versus independent. Now, the next couple of things get a little bit more complicated, but it's still really talking about the same idea. So basically, what happens is we use this R selected or K selected in order to kind of describe groups of animal or groups of living things based on how they survive. So the first one is R selected. Now, our R selected, meaning that they are not controlled by the carrying capacity, which is K, see exponential. You see this exponential increase. They produce as much as they possibly can and hope that some of them survive. Oysters, if you aren't aware, can lay up to like 1 million eggs every spawning season. 1 million possible young. Exponential growth. Dandelions, constant, never ending. So there are lots of other species that are all R selected. And usually we're going to see R selection in a lot of species that are usually relatively low on the food chain. Because I say this like they're aware of it, but basically, this behavior that has evolved has done so because without large numbers, There's no way to keep their species alive because so many things eat them. So they just need to reproduce as though there is no limitation, because in a natural environment there never will be a limitation to their population. There will just be other predators and stuff that keep them in check. Then we've got our case selected. Case selected are the ones that get up near the carrying capacity. Case selected species tend to be very slow to breed, tend to be very slow to grow, and they have to follow a more logistic model, because kind of like an elephant or a human, you're seeing a scenario where we don't pump out 18 kids per reproductive cycle, we do one. And it is important to note that most animals are on the continuum, right? We've got our R selected on one side, our K selected on the other. Most things fall somewhere in between the two. So understand that it's not a perfect delineation. It's just kind of a general reference that we can use to kind of talk generally and just say, oh, yeah, well, pumas are really kind of a case selected species. And then anybody who's listening to that will go, okay, I get the idea then. All right. Should be. Um, that's all we're going to do for today. Hopefully, that wasn't too brain bending as we start to move into our survivorship curves, which is what we'll go over tomorrow. And then we'll have a sea turtle case study, which is not much. You guys should be able to handle it quite easily. So I hope that helps.